It is just after midnight on February 28, 1942, and the cliffs above the French village of Bruneval are silent except for the wind coming off the channel. On a plateau above the beach stands a modest villa, its garden dominated by something altogether stranger than a garden ornament. A great dish of metal, roughly the size of a small car turned on its side, tilted towards the black sky. Nearby, in a concrete bunker, a handful of German technicians monitor dials, tracking aircraft that pass overhead on their way to bomb the Reich. They have no reason to think tonight is different from any other night. Then the sky above them fills with parachutes. Within minutes, more than 100 British paratroopers are on the ground, moving with a speed and purpose that suggests months of rehearsal, because it is. Their objective is not to kill the technicians, though some will die. It is not to destroy the strange metal dish, though the temptation must have been immense. Their objective is to steal it, or rather to steal its heart, the delicate electronic components inside, the components that make this device one of the most dangerous pieces of technology in Hitler's arsenal. This is the Würzburg radar, and by early 1942 it has become the invisible eye-guiding German night fighters onto British bombers with terrifying precision. For the men now sprinting across a moonlit French field, understanding how that eye sees is a matter of national survival. Radio direction. Finding what we now simply call radar was Britain's own quiet miracle. The technology that had helped win the Battle of Britain by giving fighter squadrons early warning of incoming raids. But the Germans had radar too, and by the winter of 1941 it was becoming horribly clear that theirs was getting better, and that Bomber Command's losses over occupied Europe were climbing because of it. What happens over the next 2.5 hours on that cliff top will decide how many British aircrew live or die in the years that follow. It will also become one of the most audacious feats of the entire war. A raid conceived not by generals thinking in terms of territory, but by a young scientist thinking in terms of wavelengths, dismantled not with explosives but with a spanner, and carried out by men who had never fought a real battle in their lives. This is the story of Operation Biting, and why a garden ornament on a French cliff-top became one of the most fought-over objects of the Second World War. By the autumn of 1941, RAF Bomber Command was flying into a wall it could not see. Aircraft losses over Germany and occupied France had begun climbing at a rate that alarmed even hardened planners in Whitehall. Crews returned, when they returned at all, describing an eerie new pattern. Night fighters seemed to know exactly where they were, closing in through cloud and darkness as though guided by an unseen hand. In a sense, they were. German engineers had developed a ground-based radar system, codenamed Würzburg, capable of tracking a single bomber with an accuracy of within a few dozen meters, feeding that data to searchlight batteries, anti-aircraft guns, and fighter controllers in what became known as the Kamm-Huber line, a chain of overlapping radar and interception zones stretching across the Reich's western approaches. British intelligence had known for some time that German radar existed. Aerial reconnaissance photographs had picked up strange circular installations along the French coast, and a scientist named Reginald Victor Jones, working within the Air Ministry's Scientific Intelligence Branch, had spent months piecing together fragments of evidence, intercepted radio signals, prisoner interrogations, and the photographs themselves. What Jones could not do was explain, in the kind of technical detail that would let British engineers build a countermeasure, precisely how the German equipment worked. Guessing at a wavelength was not good enough. Britain needed the machine itself, or at least its working parts, and it needed them intact. This was the impossible part of the problem. Bombing the installation into rubble would have been simple enough and had in fact been considered. But a radar set destroyed by a 500-pound bomb tells you nothing except that bombs work. What Jones needed was a set gently prized apart by trained hands, its transmitter, receiver, and aerial mechanism lifted out largely undamaged, so that boffins back in England could examine exactly how the Germans were achieving such accuracy. That meant getting men onto German-occupied soil, right beside an active military installation, taking what they needed without destroying it, and getting out again before reinforcements arrived. No such raid had been attempted before on this scale of technical precision. Commando raids up to this point had been about demolition and disruption, not delicate extraction. A conventional naval assault from the sea was ruled out. The cliffs at Bruneval were too well defended, and any approach by water would be spotted long before troops reached the radar station. The station itself sat close to a fortified villa garrisoned by German soldiers, with further defenses dug in nearby. Every existing method of attack risked either alerting the enemy in time for them to destroy the equipment themselves, or destroying it inadvertently in the assault. The only real option left was one nobody had properly tried: dropping men from the sky directly onto the target in the middle of the night. There was also a narrower, more human dimension to the problem, one that rarely makes it into the official histories. Aircrew losses were not abstract statistics to the men who flew the raids. They were empty chairs in mess halls, letters written to widows, and a mounting sense among Bomber Command's leadership that something had changed in the enemy's ability to find them in the dark. Pilots reported being coned by searchlights that seemed to know their altitude before they had even finished a turn, or intercepted by night fighters that appeared from nowhere on a moonless night with no visual reference at all. Nobody flying those missions understood why, only that the odds had shifted, quietly and without explanation, against them. That unease traveled up the chain of command and eventually landed on desks in Whitehall, where men like Jones were left trying to explain a phenomenon they could not yet fully measure. Solving it was not simply a matter of scientific curiosity. It was, by early 1942, a matter of how many more bombers Britain could afford to lose before the entire strategic bombing campaign became unsustainable. The task of solving this fell to a partnership that, on paper, looked unlikely. On one side sat Jones, the scientific intelligence officer whose insistence that the radar be captured rather than bombed had won over skeptical planners at Combined Operations Headquarters, then under the command of Lord Louis Mountbatten. On the other sat the men who would actually have to do the capturing. C Company of the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, commanded by a 30-year-old major named John Frost, alongside a specially recruited team of Royal Air Force technical personnel whose job was not to fight, but to understand what they were looking at once they got there. Chief among these technicians was Flight Sergeant Charles Cox, a radar mechanic who had never jumped from an aircraft before volunteering for the raid, and who trained for weeks to master a parachute descent purely so that he could be the man kneeling beside the Würzburg set with a set of tools while bullets flew around him. This detail alone tells you something about how seriously Britain took this mission. Rather than trust the extraction to soldiers guessing at what mattered, they sent an expert who could recognize a vital component at a glance and remove it without wrecking it. The plan itself, worked out over weeks of rehearsal on the Wiltshire and Scottish moors, was a masterpiece of choreography. Paratroopers would drop inland from the radar station under cover of darkness, then split into groups with separate objectives: one to assault the villa and overpower the German garrison, one to secure the radar installation itself and hold it while Cox did his work, and one to fight through to the beach below the cliffs and clear a path for evacuation. A naval force of landing craft, supported by Royal Navy destroyers offshore, would wait just beyond sight of land, ready to sweep in and extract the entire party once the job was done. Timing was everything. Everyone involved understood that the Germans, once alerted, would move reinforcements towards Bruneval within the hour, so the raiders had perhaps that long to drop, fight, dismantle, retreat, and re-embark before being cut off against the sea with their backs to the channel. Cox's job, once on the ground, was almost surgical. The Würzburg dish itself, a parabolic reflector roughly 3 meters across, mounted on a rotating pedestal not unlike a large searchlight, was of less interest than the cabin of electronics feeding it. Working largely by torchlight while paratroopers exchanged fire with German defenders barely meters away, Cox unbolted the transmitter and receiver units, photographed the wiring where he could, and where components would not come free cleanly, simply cut them out with wire cutters and carried them off wrapped in whatever cloth came to hand. It was less a scientific extraction than a hurried burglary conducted under a hail of bullets, but it worked, because the man doing it knew precisely which pieces of gray German engineering represented months of secrets and which were merely scaffolding. To understand why this mattered so much, it helps to picture what the Würzburg set actually did, stripped of its jargon. Imagine a torch beam, except instead of light it threw out a narrow pulse of radio energy, sweeping across the sky and bouncing back the moment it struck something solid. An aircraft, a flock of birds, a passing cloud of chaff. Had anyone thought to invent such a thing yet? The set measured the time that pulse took to return, translating it instantly into a precise range and bearing, accurate enough to guide a searchlight or a night fighter onto a bomber that its own crew could not see with the naked eye. The rotating dish itself made a low mechanical hum as it swept back and forth, not unlike a large electric fan turning at a steady rhythm, while inside the adjoining hut, a small crew of technicians read dials and called corrections down a telephone line to gun batteries or fighter controllers. The entire apparatus, dish, pedestal, and control cabin together weighed under a ton and could be assembled by a trained crew in a matter of hours, which explains why the Germans had been able to seed dozens of similar installations along the coast of occupied Europe with relative speed. Manufactured in factories across Germany under conditions of considerable secrecy, exact production figures for the Würzburg family of radars remain difficult to pin down with certainty even today, though historians generally agree that many hundreds were eventually built and deployed as the Kammhuber line expanded through 1942 and 1943. The raid itself unfolded largely as planned, though not without chaos. Frost's men dropped slightly off target in the darkness, some landing well away from their intended zones, but reorganized quickly enough to storm the villa and overwhelm its garrison within minutes. Fighting around the radar station itself was sharp but brief, the German technicians and a small guard detachment offering resistance before being driven off or captured. With the position secured, Cox set to work stripping the Würzburg set of its most valuable components while the perimeter held against increasingly determined counterfire from German positions further along the cliff. The fiercest fighting of the night came not at the radar site but at the beach, where the party assigned to secure the evacuation route found the way blocked by German troops in a defensive position nobody had anticipated, forcing Frost's men into a desperate, close-quarters assault to clear a path down to the sand. What followed was, by most accounts, one of the tensest half-hours of the entire operation. The naval evacuation force, delayed and briefly out of contact, arrived later than planned, leaving the raiding party pinned on an open beach under fire with the radar components already in hand, but no obvious way off French soil. When the landing craft finally appeared out of the darkness, the extraction was carried out under continuing fire from the cliffs above, covered by supporting fire from Royal Navy vessels offshore. British losses amounted to a small number killed, a handful wounded, and a few men left behind and captured, a modest toll set against the scale of what had been achieved. German losses were similarly limited, though several technicians and defenders were killed or taken prisoner, one of whom, notably, was brought back to England along with the equipment for further interrogation. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a tap. Germany, for its part, never attempted anything resembling Operation Biting against British radar installations, largely because it never needed to. By 1942, the strategic bombing campaign ran overwhelmingly in one direction, from Britain towards the Reich, meaning German intelligence had far less incentive to risk elite troops raiding a chain home station on the English coast when photographic reconnaissance and signals intelligence largely sufficed for their purposes. Where the comparison becomes sharper is in how each side handled the technical exploitation of captured equipment more broadly. German scientists, when they recovered damaged British radar sets from crashed aircraft, tended to reconstruct function from wreckage, a slower and less certain method than Britain's decision to send trained technicians directly to source. American forces entering the European theater later largely inherited the fruits of Bruneval secondhand, benefiting from British radar intelligence sharing without having needed to mount an equivalent raid of their own. In this narrow sense, Operation Biting stands almost alone, a deliberate, planned, technically literate raid whose entire purpose was scientific espionage rather than territorial or purely military gain. Later, Allied special operations would occasionally echo its logic, snatching equipment or personnel for intelligence value rather than destruction, but few matched its combination of technical precision and battlefield audacity within a single continuous operation. The material harvested at Bruneval proved immediately and enormously useful. British scientists, Jones prominent among them, were able to confirm the operating wavelength of the Würzburg system and understand its targeting mechanism with a clarity no amount of guesswork could have provided. This fed directly into the development of countermeasures, most famously window, the simple strips of aluminium foil that, dropped in clouds from bombers later in the war, would flood German radar screens with false echoes and blind the very system Cox had once knelt beside with a torch and a set of pliers. The psychological effect on German confidence in their own technical security is harder to measure but should not be dismissed. A raid of this precision, executed so deep inside supposedly secure territory, forced a reassessment of coastal defenses and radar site security that diverted resources and attention for the remainder of the war. For combined operations and the fledgling parachute regiment, meanwhile, Bruneval was a proof of concept, a demonstration to skeptical planners in London that airborne raiding could achieve precise, limited objectives rather than merely blunt disruption, a lesson that would echo forward into far larger airborne operations later in the war, including the vast airborne assaults that would follow at Normandy and Arnhem. The raid also did wonders for morale at a stage of the war when British forces badly needed a clear, unambiguous success to celebrate. Newspapers at the time, working within the limits of wartime censorship, were permitted to report a daring raid on the French coast, and the story of paratroopers dropping from the night sky to snatch a secret weapon from under the noses of the German army captured public imagination in a way that dry accounts of radar wavelengths never could have managed on their own. Historians remain divided on precisely how much of Britain's subsequent success against German radar can be traced directly to the Bruneval Haul versus other intelligence sources gathered around the same period, and this uncertainty is worth stating plainly rather than glossing over. What is not in serious dispute is that the raid removed a significant blind spot in British understanding almost overnight, converting months of cautious inference into hard engineering fact. Today, fragments of the story survive in museums and archives rather than on the clifftop itself, the villa long gone, the radar dish long since scrapped, though a monument now stands near the original site commemorating the raid, and elements of the recovered technology and related documents can still be viewed by visitors to service museums in Britain. The components Cox carried back across the Channel that night passed through British laboratories and, in doing so, quietly reshaped the electronic war in the skies over Europe. Return for a moment to that cliff-top garden, to the strange metal dish tilted towards the stars and the men creeping towards it through the dark. What they took that night was not, in the end, a single piece of equipment. It was certainty, the kind of hard technical knowledge that no amount of clever guesswork in a London office could have produced, delivered at the point of a bayonet by men who had trained for months to make a 2-hour raid look almost effortless. What was achieved was, in the sparest possible terms, this. A garden ornament became a blueprint. A blueprint became a countermeasure, and a countermeasure helped keep bomber crews alive over Germany for years afterwards. Every strip of foil later scattered from a Lancaster's belly, blinding a Würzburg operator somewhere below, traces its lineage back to a torchlit half-hour beside that cliff. It was audacious because it had never been tried. It worked because the men who planned it understood that stealing a secret is a different discipline entirely from winning a battle, one measured not in ground held but in knowledge carried home intact. It mattered because in a war increasingly decided by invisible waves and unseen signals, the side that understood the enemy's eyes could learn, eventually, how to blind them. The Germans built a machine that could see through darkness. The British sent men through that same darkness to steal its secrets, and got away with it. That, in the end, is the whole of Operation Biting. Not a battle won, but a mystery solved, one bolt, one wire, one stolen radar set at a time.